And so we will be able to email this recorded webinar to all registrants. You can revisit this information and also share it with others. So before we start the presentation, I would like to introduce you all to my colleague, Meredith Tilley, with the San Antonio Parks and Recreation Department. Meredith is going to give some background information about the Historic Eastside Cemeteries and the new Cemetery Stewardship Program. So Meredith, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. So my name is Meredith Tilley. I'm an assistant Parks and Recreation manager, with San Antonio Parks and Recreation. And I oversee the stewardship division. So that means all things volunteer. But one of the other big aspects of my position is to oversee the historic city cemeteries. So over the recent years, that meant really just monitoring for vandalism and damage and monitoring the mowing contract. But now that it's under the stewardship division, why not bring the two together, volunteers and the cemetery program? So this is where this idea started to come to play when I'm working with Rachel, who then brought in Izabella, and we started to think we can do a really hands-on fun program that will be really focused on preservation, engagement, and really just educating San Antonio about the really rich asset they have in the Eastside cemeteries. So the Eastside Cemetery Complex runs along East Houston Street, Commerce Street, and it's just really gorgeous. It's under the city is 15 individual cemeteries. So that's the city cemetery number 1 through 6. And there's a lot of very small little cemeteries that's added into that to bring us up to the 15. And that is approximately 50 acres. The entire complex is well over 100 acres. So there's a lot of private organizations that have their cemeteries in this area. And this program is meant to be not just for the city cemeteries, but to bring this education out to those other organizations so they can bring those preservation techniques out to their own areas. But all our volunteers will be working on the city cemetery side. So bring all that goodness. So that's just a little bit of background. They're gorgeous. If you haven't been out there, please go visit. Right now, usually is about wildflower time. When we walked the grounds last week, we found a lot of our pollinator friends out there. The butterflies were in their cocoons and fluttering around. The flowers are beautiful, and of course, all the monuments in history. So, but that's really my really brief introduction to the Eastside Cemetery Complex, and I'll go ahead and turn it back over to y'all.
Thank you so much, Meredith. So we are so thrilled to be joined by Izabella Nuckels today, who will be sharing her expertise in cemetery conservation. Izabella Nuckels is an Austin-based architectural conservator. She has particular interest in preserving vernacular resources, historic color, preventative maintenance, and preservation education. Izabella teaches materials conservation in the Historic Preservation Graduate Program at UT Austin, is a preservation consultant with Post Oak Preservation, a Texas-based full-service historic preservation consulting firm, and consults as an architectural conservator in private practice. She is the current president of the Texas chapter of the Association for Preservation Technology, a cross-disciplinary international organization dedicated to promoting the best technology for conserving historic structures and their settings. And she holds the designation of professional associate with the American Institute for Conservation. So thank you, Izabella, so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see, does that work? Great. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Great. All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. And thank you to both Rachel and Meredith. We had a really great site visit last week in the San Antonio cemeteries. They're beautiful sites. They've been well taken care of by the city of San Antonio, and I'm excited to be working with them. As Rachel mentioned, I'm an architectural conservator, so I work with historic building materials that are out in the outdoors, they're in the active built environment, and cemeteries really have all of those materials. So I work to help preserve them with stabilization, restorations, and different kind of preventative maintenance strategies. So today we're going to talk about best practices for approaching cemetery preservation. So we're going to talk generally about kind of how to approach any type of preservation project in your cemeteries. We'll start out by talking about the anatomy of the cemetery. What is kind of involved in the site? What are the different features? You know, you may initially think about monuments, but there are so many other historic features in cemeteries that are part of the historic site that really need to be preserved and taken care of as well. We'll go on to talk about some of the common cemetery materials that you'll find in Central Texas in particular. So there may be different materials that you'll find in the Northeast or in the Pacific Northwest or in different countries around the world. But in Central Texas, we have kind of a very specific material fabric in our cemeteries. We'll look at some different material conditions that are common in Central Texas. So we have, you know, hot summers, we have dry grounds, we have those big rains. So we have a lot, you know, different conditions that you might see in other parts of the country that are unique to Central Texas. You know, we don't deal with the same freezes and thaws and things of that nature. We have, you know, specific landscapes and grounds. So those really contribute to the conditions of our materials across Central Texas. We'll talk about some best practices for cemetery preservation. So, you know, what are some treatment approaches? We'll talk about kind of the process for going through a preservation project in a cemetery, and then we'll go over some resources that you can reference for more information. And there are so many different materials in cemeteries, so many different ages of monuments and resources. You know, you have vernacular homemade monuments, you have high style hand carved monuments, you have Sears monuments. So there's just a ton of different stuff in cemeteries. It's all really interesting. And so I'm really just going to be able to gloss over that, but I would encourage you to visit the City of San Antonio cemeteries if you haven't yet. So, you know, when we're approaching cemetery preservation, many people focus first on monuments. And I think it's really important to understand kind of the anatomy of the cemetery, the elements that are present on the site. So this may include, you know, fencing, buildings, gates, landscaping. Landscaping could be planned landscaping. It could be organic landscaping that evolved from, you know, people planting or from trees or from squirrels, birds, things of that nature. There also may be different types of plants and flowers that are associated with cultural burial and interment traditions. So you might find those in cemeteries. And then cemeteries also have lots that have specific features. These have curbing, they may have steps, they may have fencing, they may have family monuments, benches, ornamental elements like urns, sculptures. So there's all sorts of different things you're going to find inside your cemetery. So this is a view from Google Earth of San Antonio City Cemetery. I believe it's looking at number 1 towards number 3. And cemetery sites really vary. They vary across the country, across the world immensely. They vary across Central Texas. They may be organized in rows with roads and pathways between lots. They may be formally platted. They may also have evolved organically and have an informal layout. They may be fenced off, they may be open to adjacent property and areas, and they may include one grave or thousands of graves. So there's really such a big variety of cemeteries that you'll find. A lot of formally platted cemetery sites, like the ones you'll find in San Antonio, are often landscaped to some extent. And there could also be areas that have no vegetation at all. So you can see in this image that you have kind of these pockets of different sized trees. I did a little bit of searching around the San Antonio Genealogical and Historical Society website, and they say that there are over 250 cemeteries in Bexar County. So each county in Texas has hundreds of cemeteries. There may be other cemeteries and graves in your county that haven't been discovered yet. So certainly volunteer efforts are really important in helping to maintain these sites. And so the large image is the San Antonio Cemetery, and then I've included some smaller images of some different kind of landscapes that you'll find in cemeteries. One is in Georgia and the other is in Nevada. So, you know, some have these giant luscious trees and some may just be kind of in this desert landscape. So one of the, you know, most prominent features of the cemetery is kind of the base of the cemetery, which is the natural landscape. Cemeteries often have native species that were historically common to your community, to your kind of area of the city. And these, you know, trees and plants may be intact more so than in planned developments or residential areas. So it's a really great place not just to look at monuments and historic objects, but also to look at the natural landscape. You'll find just a variety of trees in different sizes. You'll find bushes, you'll find flowers, you'll find kind of different plantings associated with burials. As Meredith mentioned, we saw tons of wildflowers out there, a huge variety when we were walking around. So certainly the landscape is something that also needs to be preserved. It needs to be documented, and it's part of what makes cemeteries really special. So then on top of your landscape, you'll have all of these infrastructure features. Some of these may have been constructed when the cemetery was, platted. Some of these may have been later additions. You may have a perimeter fence, you may not have a perimeter fence. You may have entry gates. I know this particular cemetery had some really nice masonry entry gates. You may have flagpoles that could have historical plantings around them. They could be new. You may have benches in certain areas. You may have buildings. So this cemetery has a building that you'll see towards the left of the screen. You may also have historical markers, plaques. These may have been, sanctioned by the state. These may be more informal markers and plaques. So you have all sorts of other features kind of to help navigate and make the cemetery a usable space. And then kind of within the site, you'll have lots. So cemeteries may be organized informally, where you just have single graves. They may also be platted and organized in lots, like this cemetery is. Those lots may include members of a single family. They may include members of specific organizations. They may also be single graves. Many lots have curbing around them, so that's basically just like a street curb. It's kind of a low fence. It's often made out of some kind of masonry or concrete. It may have decorative cornerstones or an entry step. There may be some kind of inscription describing who's in there, if it's a family or an organization. There are so many different types of lots, and we'll look at pictures of a couple of them. If you look towards the bottom of the screen, there are a couple of lots that were totally covered with concrete, which is not uncommon either. They could also be fenced with cast iron or wrought iron fences. They may have historically been fenced with wood fencing that may no longer be there just due to time. So there are kind of so many different characteristics that you can find at the lots as well. And then the lot also may have some ornamental features. So this is a page from a Sears catalog from 1904 that just is describing a couple of the lot features that you can purchase: benches and urns that you can put in your family lot. This is an actual really nice faux bois ornamental bench at City Cemetery number 3 in San Antonio, and the whole lot has this really interesting kind of applied art, decorative art theme to it. You may find decorative urns, you may find planters, there may be sculptures, there may be kind of different effects that are special to that particular family or organization or lot for whatever reason. And these could be in a variety of materials. So sometimes they're handmade, sometimes they're purchased from Sears, sometimes they're hand carved. So there's kind of a variety of lot ornamentation that you may find in cemeteries. And then, of course, you have your monuments. So within your lot, you may also have a monument. Often monuments for people who are interred or buried include headstones placed at the head of the space, footstones that were historically marked the end of the space. Headstones and footstones come in a variety of forms and materials and sizes and placement. You may also have family monuments, commemorative monuments, veterans monuments, all sorts of different monuments. And there's just a variety that you'll find in cemeteries. You may also have interments or burials that don't have any monuments, that had wood monuments that have deteriorated, that had granite monuments that have sunk underground and are no longer visible, or that never had monuments at them. So that's, all part of the fabric of the cemetery. So next we're going to talk about some of the materials that you'll find in cemeteries in Central Texas. So I love Texas materials. That's really kind of my passion. And you can find some great materials in the different cemeteries across Central Texas in particular. And these really kind of represent the different building materials as well that you'll see across our region. So kind of the common materials that you'll find, you'll see marble or limestone. So that's, our nice soft native limestone. It's an easy stone to carve. You'll see it in a lot of earlier monuments, kind of mid to late 19th century. So the mid to late 1800s in Texas. You'll find marble. That's a very common cemetery monument across the United States. It's easy to carve. It looks beautiful. It takes a polish really well. So it's typically white, but there may be different colors. You might see granite monuments. So this is the material that a lot of monuments are still made out of. It's the most durable of our first three materials. It has a very tight pore structure. It is harder to carve, but it takes really precise carving and holds up really well. And you'll see granite kind of all over cemeteries, including today. You'll find concrete. Sometimes concrete was cast into monuments, sometimes different kind of aggregate or sand that has reflective qualities was added to concrete to kind of give it the effect of granite. Concrete is sometimes used for curbs on lots. It may be used for bases. So concrete is used in many ways across cemeteries. We'll talk about each of these little materials a little bit, but concrete is a material that the technology has evolved significantly in the last 150, 200 years. So the concrete that we use today, which is Portland cement based, is different than the concrete that was historically used. It's a very different mixture. Then you might have iron. So most of the kind of fencing that you'll see in cemeteries is cast iron or wrought iron. Iron, of course, is a material that corrodes, so it turns that red rust color. And then kind of the lesser used materials that you may see in cemeteries are brick. You may see these for table tombs. You may see these for kind of bases in some instances. You may see these for vernacular monuments. Zinc monuments, these are really interesting and unique. They're actually cast zinc and they're hollow on the inside. These were manufactured during the late 19th century into the early 20th century. They hold up surprisingly well in most cases. Sometimes you'll see kind of sagging up the seams, but because they are mostly kind of a high purity of zinc, they actually do hold up very well, and they're actually sandblasted to look like stone, but they're made out of metal, and if you kind of knock on them, you can tell. And then you might have wood monuments. These are relatively rare just because wood deteriorates when exposed to moisture. It creates an environment for different biological growth that feeds off of the wood. So anything that's set in the ground that's not in a desert will often kind of not last too long unless set in a really in a way that's really sensitive to preservation. So the reason that we're talking about the different materials is because understanding what the material is really the first step to preserving the physical assets of a cemetery. So because I'm a materials person and I teach about materials, we're going to just go back to the basics and talk about what rock is. So rock is made up of minerals. So it's these things that are naturally formed in our earth. They're made up of one or more minerals. Minerals are these inorganic, naturally forming, really spectacular, materials found in nature. Stone is a word that we use kind of in conversation generally to talk about rocks that have been processed, or sometimes we call it dressed. There are three main types of rocks. So you have sedimentary rocks. So these have been formed by compacted sedimentary deposits. They're usually found at kind of the bottom of ancient oceans. They sometimes have, those fossils because they're, compacted deposits of crustaceans and ancient coral reefs. So this is our limestone and our sandstone. It tends to be very porous, but very easy to carve and abundant in central Texas. Next up, you'll have metamorphic rocks. These are your marbles and your slates. And these are actually sedimentary rocks that have been recrystallized through elevated temperature or pressure. So they have similar qualities to sedimentary rocks, but are a little bit harder. And then lastly, you'll have your igneous rocks. So that's our granites and basalts. And gabbro, and these were formed from magma that cools and solidifies. These are kind of three main types of rocks, and the reason that this is important because the type of rock informs properties like hardness, how easy it is to carve, and then also sensitivity to acid, which determines what products you might be able to use. So this is an image of some sedimentary rock deposits in Arizona. I'm going to briefly talk about kind of our main materials, and then we'll talk about some of the different conditions that you'll see. So limestone, these are some limestone monuments at the City of San Antonio Cemeteries. Limestone, again, it's that sedimentary rock. It's made from compacted sedimentary deposits. It's very porous. It's primarily calcium carbonate. It's usually a cream or yellow color. It's very common for monuments in kind of the earlier 19th century. It's easy to carve, but unfortunately it's not the most durable in this carved state in exterior environments. So it can be durable in blocks used in architectural applications, but these fine carvings just really don't hold up over time. Unfortunately, calcium carbonate, which is the main component of limestone, is acid soluble. That means if you apply acid or an acid-based cleaner to limestone, it will actually start to dissolve. It will react with the acid to form carbon dioxide, so it will actually dissolve. One of the tests that we do in architectural conservation to do mortar analysis is diluting different crushed up mortars with hydrochloric acid, because the acid actually dissolves the lime that's in the mortar samples, and that's made out of limestone. So you'll see a lot of limestone monuments and cemeteries in central Texas that are really not in good shape. To undertake a full restoration is a very complex endeavor. So these monuments, it's so important to document before they deteriorate anymore, and to stabilize them as much as possible. Next up, we have marble. Marble is a beautiful material. As I mentioned, it's a metamorphic rock. So that is kind of a sedimentary rock that has been recrystallized through elevated heat and pressure. So pure marble, which is pure white, is actually metamorphized calcium carbonate, which is the main ingredient in or component of limestone. Sometimes you'll see marble with those beautiful veins going through them. So those veins are actually mineral impurities. So those are things that are not calcium carbonate. One thing to remember when you have marble with a lot of veins is that different minerals will react to different cleaning products, for instance. So you may have, a monument that you're working on, you're applying a product, and the white looks great, but nothing's happening to the veins, and that's because they have kind of different compositions. Marble in general is easy to carve. It's very soft. It's often polished, although the polish sometimes will kind of erode over time. Because marble and metamorphic rocks are those kind of recrystallized sedimentary rocks, they can also be damaged by acid. So they can be acid soluble, acid rain, and different chemicals can be very detrimental to both marbles and limestones in our cemetery. And then, our last and hardiest of these three rocks is granite. So this is an igneous rock. It usually consists of quartz, feldspar, mica, might have biotite, hornblende. This is an image of granite, and I'm not sure if y'all can see it since I know everyone's on a computer screen, but the different colors in granites, how it has the different flecks, those are actually different minerals, and you can identify the minerals based on the kind of different colorations that are in the granite. So this is from Yosemite, this little image from the National Park Service. And this is a granite monument that you'll see that you can see in the city of San Antonio Cemetery. One of the neat things about granite is that based on the composition, which you can see from the different kind of colors and inclusions, that actually provides information about the rock's history, its thermal history, how fast it cooled, how much time it spent at different temperatures. As probably know, granite ranges in color. It has, a number of different minerals that can be in it. And as I mentioned, it's from those kind of magma bubbles. This is very general geology, but the magma bubbles kind of rising to the surface, cool, and they become granite. So if anyone's familiar with Enchanted Rock in Central Texas, that's a big, large piece of granite, igneous rock. So the hardness of cemetery materials is, one of the aspects that really informs its durability in outdoor environments, and its, exposure to not only the elements, but also people, wildlife, kind of the moving landscape. And this is something that we talk a lot about in preservation and conservation. When we have those soft materials, we want to be really sensitive to how we are interacting with them, making sure they're stable, making sure they're preserving them. When we have those harder materials like granite, we can take a different approach because it's a harder material. And this is something that people have known for a long time. This is a 1904 monument catalog that's talking about Georgia marble and about the formation, about the composition, and how because of the composition of this marble, it's impervious to elements like water, and it's quote unquote durable beyond question. So this is something that people have been talking about with monuments for over 100 years, even longer. So durability is really something that we think about when we're doing any kind of treatments. And people have been talking about, the hardness of materials, especially stones, for hundreds of years. This is something called the Mohs hardness scale. So it basically uses kind of a comparison of different known materials to sort of quantify hardness. This type of comparison and testing has been going on in record since 300 BC. There was a document called On Stone where a scholar kind of described this method, but the Mohs scale, this is again from the National Park Service, is something we use today. It was developed by Friedrich Mohs, who's a German geologist and mineralogist, and it basically determines hardness based on the ability of one mineral to visibly scratch another. So it's kind of an interesting scale, but we use it, and as you can see, marble and limestone are usually 3 to 5, so they vary in terms of hardness, and that puts us, around the hardness of between, a copper penny and a, glass plate or a knife, and then granite is way up there. We're kind of above steel nails going towards masonry drill bits. So you can see that granite is almost twice as hard as limestone and marble. So then we have concrete. So concrete is one of our man-made masonry materials. It's composed of a binder that's often cement. It may be lime. It could be Portland cement today. It has an aggregate, so that's usually in concrete a coarse gravel and a sand. It always has water that activates the binder. It heats it up, and the binder acts as a glue that holds everything together. And there may be some types of additives for different performance qualities. There are many different compositions of concrete, especially historic concrete. There may have been aggregates that were used from kind of the local site, or a local kind of depository of sand or gravel. So you'll see kind of a lot of different applications. This is a piece of granite, or a piece of concrete rather, that has marble inscription inset into it. And this, as I mentioned, is a really coarse concrete. It has some aggregate that has reflective qualities, so it sort of mimics granite in some aspects, which is really neat. And concrete is often used in vernacular homemade monuments, and is really kind of a special man-made material that you'll find in a lot of cemeteries. So I mentioned zinc monuments. These were quote unquote called bronze monuments. That's how they were marketed. They were sandblasted to look like stone. As I said, zinc content is relatively high, so that makes the monument pretty stable. You'll see some of these when they get really tall. Sometimes the seams will fail and they'll kind of start to sag a little bit because they're hollow on the inside. But in general, a lot of them are in really great condition, and the bases are usually zinc as well. So when we're talking about these monuments, we're talking about kind of all of these different materials in the cemetery. It's important to kind of understand the basic construction. And a lot of times, different elements of monuments historically were made out of different materials. And so this kind of lends itself to different types of deterioration. It also may lend itself to specific treatments. So, very generally, cemetery monuments have a die. So that's the kind of vertical piece that has inscriptions on it. And then it usually has a base of some sort. Sometimes dies are set directly in the ground, but often they're on a base. There also may be some kind of foundation. It's usually concrete that's either adhered to the base or kind of is a platform that's set in the ground, and then the base is set on top of it. So the die could be made out of any of those materials that we just talked about. In general, the bases in Central Texas for historic monuments a lot of times are limestone when the die is marble or limestone. It could be granite. Typically, if you have a granite die, you'll have a granite base. It could be marble in some cases. It could also be concrete. You'll also see some newer bases that were kind of fabricated in the recent past that are made out of concrete. Again, foundations, typically concrete. If those are kind of below ground or below grade, they may also be granite. We're looking sort of into the construction. So you may have some monuments that are set directly in the ground. Footstones a lot of times are set directly in the ground, although they sometimes have bases. You may have a die on base. So this is common with newer granite monuments where you literally have a big die that is set on a base, and you usually have some kind of mortar or caulking that is between the two to kind of adhere them. Historically, there were a number of monuments that were made with a pin between the base and the die. This kind of helped with movement in the absence of the absence of having kind of an adhesive of sorts in between. These pins historically were made out of some iron-containing material, so many of them have corroded because of moisture getting into that area, and they've corroded to the point where they've snapped or just kind of really failed. And then you also may have a die-in socket, so the base may have a hole cut out in it, and your die fits right into that socket. It's a little slot. There's usually a perimeter around, and it was sometimes set in a lime-based mortar. So that's a very soft mortar to keep it from moving around. Sometimes there were pins inside the socket that went into the die as well. And then, as I mentioned, there are so many different monuments in cemeteries. You'll have bedsteads, you'll have slabs, you might have mausoleums that are constructed like buildings. So there's just a variety of different kind of forms that you'll find, but you know, those kind of basic principles of the kind of stacking die on base, the pins, and the sockets are really kind of the building blocks of construction in most cemetery monuments. And then lastly, you'll have the inscription, and this also kind of informs the type of you know, treatment approach that you might have. This is an advertisement for the types of inscription that you can have from a 1906 Sears catalog. So you can have your sunken inscription that's incised into the monument. You can have raised inscriptions, and these are 2 examples from monuments in the city San Antonio cemeteries as well. And then I just want to, you know, reiterate that dies and bases were often made of different materials. One thing to remember about most building materials, but limestone and marble in particular, is that over the year, these materials move. They don't move a lot, but they move a little bit. And as water goes in and moves out, these will kind of expand and contract minute amounts. And so if you set them in a socket with Portland cement, if you set them in a very tight base, they actually will can start kind of cracking and not having the flexibility that they need. So you always want to use a lime mortar. If you have a corroded iron pin, you can replace those with an inert material like a fiberglass pin or a threaded nylon pin, something that's appropriate for kind of long-term preservation, something that's not going to actively deteriorate in this exterior environment. Some of our other site materials, of course, are metal fences. This is again from a Sears catalog. A lot of these metal fences around cemetery lots were prefabricated and ordered. They were often cast or wrought iron. They were historically painted, so iron materials corrode when exposed to air and moisture. So they're typically coated in order to keep them stable. As you can see from the kind of Sears catalog, there are a number of different installation techniques for metal fencing in cemeteries, and it's neat to go through some of these catalogs and see if you can kind of identify where some of the fencing came from before you work on it. Sometimes it'll give you some clues on its construction or some missing elements that you might have. Yeah, this is an example of a metal fence from a cemetery near Waco. This has been kind of repainted white over time. Again, if you don't maintain those coatings, you can see the red iron oxide coming out of the fencing because it's actively corroding when exposed to the environment. So metal fencing, historic metal fencing really requires maintained coatings. And then, as I mentioned, you have lots that have just a number of different materials. You have, you know, concrete, low curbing. You may have at the bottom left, you have these really great ornate limestone kind of entry posts. And then on the right side, you have that wonderful faux bois decorative lot with these beautiful kind of hand-carved, handmade elements. So there's all sorts of different kind of materials and different effects that you'll see within lots in terms of ornamentation and curbing. So, you know, because all these materials are outside all the time, they're exposed to the elements, they're near roads, so they're exposed to pollution, they're around people, so they're exposed to people, there are animals and trees and weather going on. There's all sorts of different conditions that arise, and that's normal. So, you know, historic buildings, historic cemeteries, historic sites, historic resources, they don't stay in this like new state. They do require maintenance. That's part of what we do. It's part of how we kind of preserve our collective cultural heritage together. So corrosion, as I mentioned, that's one type of deterioration that affects our metal materials. A lot of materials in cemeteries, including your fences and your pins, have iron containing elements. So most of these elements are cast or wrought iron, which are alloys. An alloy is one or two or more different metals, or metal and a non-metal. And these alloys contain iron ore, which in nature, when you find iron ore, it's a very stable metal. But when you create an alloy of it, it actually is going through this process called oxidation when it's exposed to air and moisture, and it's actually trying to revert back to its natural stable state. So that's what this poor little iron ore is doing when it's corroding. It's just trying to kind of revert back to its natural state, and it's just destabilizing in the process. And the way to address this is to maintain coatings on it. So, you know, that's not something you can do once and then forget about. That's something you need to do really every couple of years, and, you know, make sure it's an appropriate coating, make sure the surface is prepped appropriately to take a coating. So most coatings won't adhere well to dirt and dust and things of that nature. So, you know, there's a whole system, but, you know, once you have a good strategy for maintaining these metal materials, they can last for a long time. And then again, as I mentioned with the pins, typically the approach there is replacement. Inert materials like fiberglass and threaded nylon, which are smaller than the hole and do not expand and contract, are great options. One of the issues with iron pins, as most of you probably know with corrosion, is that the metal expands, so its volume gets bigger. So when it expands in that tiny hole, it will can cause breaks. It can cause the base to break. This particular example is granite, so it's very hard. But a lot of times when you have that pin corrosion and expansion in limestone or marble, you'll see cracks on the base and even sometimes on the die. It can cause the die to fall and all sorts of issues. So another type of deterioration that you may see is cracking or spalling. This is particularly bad in limestone, but you'll see it in marble. The example on the bottom is actually a pin that's corroded that's causing that crack. But this can happen just due to natural deterioration of the material. So the kind of center picture is limestone. As I mentioned, limestone is a compacted sedimentary material. So that means it's compacted in layers. And then if you cut it and you set it this way, the layers are going to start shearing off in their kind of naturally formed kind of motion. So that's something to think about. You know, some of this naturally occurs, some of it is just you know, part of limestone monuments. This picture in the center in particular, the mortar that you can see with kind of the projecting profile is actually a Portland cement based mortar. So this particular limestone is spalling because the adjacent mortar is too hard. So you always want to use compatible materials. But you'll see, you know, cracks due to vegetation growing into the pores of limestone and expanding. Sometimes you'll see due to human interaction, somebody, you know, bumps it, maintenance issues, things of that nature. So there are a number of reasons you may see that, but it's something to look out for when you're approaching any preservation projects. And then you also might see biological growths. You might see kind of on the micro level. So that's where, you know, you can visually see that color, but you really need a microscope to see what it is. You can see it on the macro level. So that's where, you know, with the naked eye, you can see this large plant growing. There are thousands of different types of biological growth, algae, lichens, molds that grow in our world. They're all over. They grow in buildings, they grow in cemeteries, and some cause harm, some don't. I'm not a microbiologist, so I don't know every single one. But certainly, you know, keeping a good record and documentation of your monuments to see if deterioration is happening, you know, doing tests to make sure that what you're cleaning is biological growth is good. But there are just a kind of a bevy of different types that you'll find out there. So these are just a couple of different ones from, I think, one cemetery near Waco but they're all over the place. And then you also may have kind of the macro level where you have, full vines kind of growing through your monument. And then, of course, some of our sources of deterioration are, human interaction. So you could have abrasions from visitors, maintenance. So this is a weed whacker striation accident, which is common, but also something to keep an eye out for and try to address as quickly as possible. You may have vandalism as well. Sometimes people tip over monuments and do other things. So I'm, trying to document those and address them to kind of prevent any more issues. And then you also have inappropriate repairs. And this is something that, is common even within the professional field of conservation. There are, products and cleaning campaigns that happened in the 20s and 30s that we now realize are not good ideas. So technologies change, products change, approaches change, best practices change. So it's not necessarily that somebody did something that was ill-advised at that time. They may have been using kind of the best practices of the time. But we certainly always want to use the, the best and the greatest in terms of technologies, products, best practices, thoughtful approaches. A lot of what you'll see is, adhesive repairs, and these are both in San Antonio cemeteries. Adhesive repairs, sometimes different adhesives dry a different color than they come out of the tube or the packaging. So often they're clear and then they'll dry. They'll actually, most adhesives are sensitive to UV, so natural light, and they'll turn a different color. So that's sometimes the issue. Sometimes most of these projects are very well-meaning, but there's something to keep an eye out for if you are doing any kind of preservation work, cleaning, restoration, treatments. You want to work on a monument that's stable or have a very good sense of what the condition is so that you don't damage the monument more or get hurt yourself. So, just identifying where there have been repairs, what those repairs are. If you are doing a restoration, you usually have to remove any inappropriate repairs. A lot of times those involve various adhesives and incompatible mortars, usually hard Portland cement mortars. So why is it important to look for kind of these different adverse effects and sources of deterioration? The main reason, and I'm a big preventative maintenance person, is preventative maintenance. So this helps you, by looking for different conditions, you can identify large scale issues. Is somebody going out and using Elmer's glue on everything? Maybe that's something that you can help to educate this volunteer to use maybe a different product. Is there invasive vegetation that is, deteriorating a large number of monuments? That's something that maybe you want to address. Are there irrigation leaks? Are things, moving? Are the monuments moving and cracking and falling? There may be some kind of underground issues. And this allows you to stop those big problems before they start and really kind of address them before they become large scale issues. You also want to look for these different conditions. So you can document changes in conditions over time, see if there are any maybe old repairs that are failing, see if there are maybe any old or new treatments, so restorations or stabilization treatments that maybe were ineffective or having adverse effects. So that's always important when we're doing preservation. Preservation is really an active, ongoing effort. And then, lastly, if you're doing cleaning or restoration or stabilization, you need to be able to determine if that monument is stable enough for you to interact with it. It can be dangerous to you. It can be dangerous to the monument's historic integrity if there are any condition issues that maybe haven't been identified. You certainly don't want an unstable monument to fall on you. You certainly don't want any kind of intervention to lead to additional deterioration. And sometimes, as you saw with those previous repairs, sometimes deterioration can be accelerated by inappropriate treatments, or new kind of different issues can arise from those. So, really having a good sense of the condition is important. So now we're going to talk about some of the best practices for cemetery preservation and how to approach a preservation project in a cemetery. And I was explaining this to Rachel and Meredith when we met, but a lot of cemetery preservation in these projects that we do, it's a lot like painting, where you spend most of the day taping off the room and preparing and picking out colors and, doing mock-ups, and you spend, a little bit of time painting, and then you take it all down and clean up and do all that. So a lot of hands-on preservation, involves preparation, getting all of your logistics in order. It involves documentation before you do anything, when you're testing product, after you're done doing it. You always want to use the gentlest means possible. So usually you're starting with low pressure water and then kind of working up from there. You always want to use materials and methods that are appropriate for historic materials, historic fabric. So that may involve a little bit of research. It may involve ordering products. So it may take a little bit more time. Safety should always be a priority when you're working in cemeteries. Cemetery monuments can be extremely heavy. I think that a square cubic foot of granite is about 160 some pounds. So you really want to make sure that these monuments, that sometimes are just a die set on a base, are not unstable, and they're not going to hurt you or anyone that you're with. And also, when you're working in a cemetery, consider the whole site. Don't just think about the monuments, but what does that fencing look like? What does the curbing look like? How are the gates? What's the landscaping look like? When you're doing preservation projects, really think about where else you can spread your efforts. So within conservation, we have kind of interventions or conservation activities that we call treatments. And the two main treatment approaches that we have for all of conservation are restoration, where we are returning an object or a structure or a site to the appearance from a specific moment in time. So I always like to think, if you are restoring a monument from 1920, if somebody time traveled from 1920 and they saw that monument, it would look just like they remembered it. So you're returning it to that appearance from that moment in time. You may be using newer technologies kind of to stabilize it, to restore it, but when it's done, it looks like it did, back in the day. And then you may also be doing stabilization. So this is a process that's really to halt deterioration. So it's to kind of maintain or preserve an object or a site for the future. And that's really what we do in preservation, is we are kind of stewards of these resources for our moment in time, and maintaining them so that, the next generation can come in and also appreciate them, enjoy them. They can still commemorate the people that they are set for, and then it's sort of should be a generational thing where everyone's continuing to work on these monuments. So within these, cemetery preservation, these two treatment approaches are really applicable. They work for not only monuments, but they work for lot features like curbing, gates, and they even work kind of for your landscapes as well. Restoration tends to be a more complex process. It needs a very thoughtful approach. You may need to hire a professional. It can sometimes be costly. However, stabilization as well as preventative maintenance are treatments that can likely need to be undertaken routinely over time, and are often really great activities for volunteers and cemetery stewards to take part in. So I'm going to go over some different types of restoration treatments, best practices, as well as some stabilization approaches. So some kind of common cemetery monument restoration treatments that you may see are patching or infill. If you have a crack, or you have kind of some kind of opening, and this prevents moisture and water from infiltrating into the monument. It helps to stabilize it as well. You may do adhesive repairs, so there are specific adhesives that are appropriate for different types of historic masonry. These usually have some water permeable qualities, so water can still move through the monument. You may be resetting dies in lime mortar beds in their base sockets. You may be doing more complex restoration, like pinning and casting new decorative elements and kind of really doing a full restoration. So, you can go from those simple resetting dies into sockets to these very complex kind of pinning, casting repairs. As I mentioned, restoration projects tend to be pretty complex. They are usually multi-step processes. They usually start with kind of cleaning and doing a condition assessment and sort of mapping out your treatment plan. They sometimes involve very simple repairs, but it really depends on the condition of the monument. Regardless, there are some kind of best practices, some reminders for good restoration. You really only want to use products that are appropriate for historic materials. So these are typically products that were formulated for and tested on historic materials. These usually aren't available in your big box home improvement hardware stores. Typically they have to be ordered. There are a lot of products on the market that are marketed for any type of masonry, but they aren't necessarily appropriate for our kind of very old historic monuments. You always want to use compatible materials. So one of our tenets in preservation is in-kind replacement. So you always want to use materials that match in color, texture, composition to a certain extent. When you're doing mortar replacement or infill, you want to make sure you're using a material that's softer than the adjacent stone, so that if you have another failure, another break, it will break at the repair instead of break at new historic material. Because once you start breaking different areas of historic material and you have to do all this different pinning, the monument really destabilizes to a large extent. Most historic monuments, other than concrete monuments, shouldn't really have any Portland cement near them. And Portland cement today, as I briefly mentioned, it's different than Portland cement was back in the day, especially in the 19th century. So it's really too hard for a lot of our materials. It doesn't allow the monument to move, so there needs to be some ability for expansion and contraction to some kind of small extent. As I mentioned, if you're using an adhesive, you want to use an adhesive that's appropriate. So some adhesives, although they look clear when they come out, they actually change colors under UV exposure. So they have adhesives that are appropriate for cemetery preservation and conservation. These often have some level of water permeability, so water can still move through the material. And application of these is also important. You don't want to lather it on like cake frosting. Usually you want to do kind of selective kind of contact point application, so that if the monument rebreaks, it's going to rebreak again at your repair, not at new historic material. And then really lastly, you want to follow the most recent guidelines and standards. They're always evolving. The more people who work on cemeteries, kind of the more great research and information there is out there. You always want to plan for continued maintenance and documentation. So it's always great to get people on board for sustained sort of volunteer efforts, because really these sites require kind of ongoing efforts. And then sometimes you may, when you're talking about restoration, need to consult a conservator or some kind of cemetery restoration specialist, somebody who has experience usually in outdoor sculptures or cemeteries. And then, what happens if you use incompatible materials? So this is a question I get a lot. It seems easy to go to Home Depot and buy, a product off the shelf, and it sometimes looks okay for a little while once you apply it, but there can be issues that arise over time. And, again, this is the image of that limestone that had Portland cement mortar applied around it that was just too hard, so the limestone is just falling away. Incompatible materials can change kind of the color, the gloss of your historic material. It can cause efflorescence, which is salts kind of migrating to the surface and destabilizing the masonry. The image at the bottom is a monument in one of the San Antonio cemeteries. It was set in a limestone base with Portland cement, and likely when it moved a little bit due to natural ground movement that happens, it hit kind of an angle at which the die didn't have any kind of room to move, and so it snapped. This repair is, it looked like some kind of more modern material that was pretty generously spread along the break, and you can actually see that water is moving kind of up to the repair, but sort of stopping right there and not moving down. So that's something that, water can concentrate at either side of the repair as it moves through masonry or moves through different stone. And of course, you don't want a new break at the historic material from, different repairs. So some stabilization approaches that you might have, you might be re-leveling or resetting, just to keep your monument, again, still sort of commemorating the person who is interred there appropriately, and also preventing it from damage from maintenance and other issues. You may be cleaning to, and again, stabilization is that where we're trying to halt deterioration and help to preserve and maintain our resource. So you could be cleaning off, soiling or biological growth or pollution. You could be replacing a corroded pin with a more kind of inert material. You may be very carefully removing that macro vegetation, that really visible large vegetation that you're doing that. If you're doing that, you're doing that by hand. You're doing it extremely carefully so that you're not destabilizing the material. And stabilization also, involves maintaining coatings. Like on your historic fences, you may be applying a rust inhibitor and then applying a paint coating and maintaining that over time. So that's certainly a stabilization approach. I wanted to talk briefly about monument cleaning. So since this is what we'll be doing in our workshop. So you always want to use the gentlest means possible when you're doing any cleaning. So you always test with water, see if water is effective, and then move up from that. You may have soiling, you may have biological growth, you may have kind of pollution related soiling or crust on it. So for, general soiling, a non-ionic detergent is always recommended for historic materials. There's a product called Orvis that is widely used in conservation from textiles to sculpture. If you have biological growth, you may use a biocide that is appropriate for historic materials. So D2 biological solution and EnviroClean BioWash are two such products. As a reminder, you only want to clean very stable monuments with known conditions. So if you are cleaning, which you're usually doing with a brush, although D2 does have a kind of spray-on application as well, any kind of brush touching a monument is considered a mechanical cleaning application. You do have the there is a chance that you can remove small amounts of historic material when you're doing any kind of brushing or cleaning or, touching the monument in any way. So, if you have any kind of loose or unstable pieces, that certainly is an issue. You also don't want to get cleaning products and moisture into cracks, especially if you can't rinse them out appropriately. So there are just a number of reasons, but really you want to make sure when you're cleaning stable monuments with known conditions. So by known conditions, I mean conditions that you know and understand to be true. So if you aren't sure, I would move on to a different monument or a different cemetery project. And then again, always test products before use. One of the reasons that we do this is not because these products are not good for the monument. It's because you don't know what product someone used last week or 10 years ago, and you want to make sure there's no adverse effects with the interaction or reaction between those two products. Some other best practices, again, only use products that are appropriate for historic masonry. You want to use soft bristled brushes. You don't want to use any really hard abrasive brushes, definitely no metals or anything of that nature. You want to use something ideally natural bristles. This is kind of a logistical one, but make sure you have enough access to water if you need to rinse something. So sometimes pipes burst in cemeteries, sometimes water's off for whatever reason. So make sure you have more than enough water if you are doing any kind of project that requires cleaning or rinsing. And that's something that you want to check with whoever's maintaining the cemetery, and you may have to bring extra water just in case. Another thing to remember is that cleaning really shouldn't be done that frequently because you want to avoid frequent contact with the historic material, just because that kind of mechanical application, that brushing can remove historic material. And if we want these monuments to stay around for many more hundreds of years, if you think about how often they may be cleaned in that time span, we want to kind of minimize our impact on them as much as possible. And then, as I mentioned briefly, these are a couple of reasons why you may want to test your cleaning products. There could be a previous coat that has, or treatment that has an adverse reaction for whatever reason with the product you're using and testing. Sometimes mineral inclusions have different reactions to your product, and this may be that it's less effective at cleaning the kind of mineral inclusions on your marble, for instance. The product could just be ineffective, period, and you don't want to kind of interact with the historic fabric, the historic material, if it's not going to be effective. So, that's when you need to move on and find something different or a different treatment approach, because we don't want to be unnecessarily working on these monuments. And then you're looking for adverse effects like changes in color or gloss, any kind of visible changes to the material. Does it look like it's dissolving if you have an acid-based cleaner, which you shouldn't be using, but if you accidentally are using one. Then I'm just briefly going to talk about removing vegetation, because that's certainly something that, all sorts of different biological growth likes to creep into cemeteries and onto different elements of the cemetery. So never, 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 never pull vegetation. If the vegetation is growing into the pores of the material, it can really kind of destabilize the surface or really the structure, especially in limestone. So you want to use hand tools. If you're using like little clippers or snippers or scissors, you want to make sure that metal does not touch the surface of the historic material at all. Work very slowly, work thoughtfully. Generally avoid spraying a lot of chemicals like weed killing chemicals around historic materials, as they can have adverse effects. Okay, I think I'm going a little long, so I'm going to kind of speed through the end here. But next we're going to go over some typical steps for a cemetery preservation project. And these steps are really applicable to monument projects, fencing projects, landscape projects. So any projects that you're doing on your cemetery site. you start by preparing to work, doing all of your preparation. You're documenting the existing conditions and making a plan. You're planning for safety. Safety is really important at historic sites, especially in cemeteries. You're doing your treatment. So like I said about your painting project, you're doing a lot of prep, a lot of setup, a very little of that kind of real like action. And then you're doing your kind of cleanup and documentation again. So when you prepare to work, the first thing you do, you've identified, I'd love to clean these 4 monuments at the city cemetery in San Antonio, the city cemetery number 3. So you would get permission, you'd call Meredith, you chat with her, and you would let her know what you're doing, when you're doing it, and make sure, she's okay with it and there aren't any other kind of permissions that you're needed. Do your research. Do you need to do research on the lot? Do you want to do kind of historic research before you start? Do you know what the materials are? Are there any interesting, elements or pieces of ornamentation that maybe need a little bit more research before you begin your project? When you're preparing, know your materials. So as I mentioned, only work on monuments if you know the material and you understand the conditions. And so, make sure, do you know that it's marble? Do you know that it's limestone? Do you know that it's granite? Do you understand that it has a stable surface? If you're unsure what the material is, maybe do a little research, maybe consult someone who's been working on monuments, but really make sure you understand what you're working with before you get to the site, before you start your project. The next thing you want to do is document, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but this is so important to do documentation before and after you do any projects. And this doesn't have to be crazy or complex. Just keep a simple record. You want to have photographic documentation. Usually you want to have a good photo of the front, some photos of the side, photo of the back. If there's any kind of interesting details or deterioration, maybe take some small photos for that. If you're doing a lot of cemetery work, it's good to have a standard set of documentation criteria. So what information are you saving and recording every time? So you're taking your photos all around. Maybe you're talking about recording what the material is, the individual who's interred, the maybe date of death, any conditions, and what you're planning on doing to it and what product you're using. Make sure these records are stored in its easily accessible location. So the photos on your phone and the notes section in your phone wouldn't be considered an easily accessible location that somebody else could access. So you want it to be somewhere that somebody could reference in the future if they're doing work, if they're doing research. And then I always recommend with sites like cemeteries, consider a location-based system. There are different sort of open source and community GIS systems that are available. And I know the city of San Antonio has some different systems as well that I can't speak to specifically, but location-based systems are always helpful in locating that monument again when someone's trying to pull that record. When you're doing your documentation, then you're planning for your treatment. So what's your treatment approach? Are you doing a stabilization? Are you doing a restoration? What is kind of the need for this specific project? And then you want to organize your logistics. So of course, with cemeteries, we always want to make sure that we schedule around interments and any kind of services, memorials that are happening. That's one of the reasons when you start that kind of communication with the cemetery manager, you can also, check in to see if anything is scheduled around the time that you're working. You also want to check for ongoing maintenance. Of course, you don't necessarily want to be working when maybe they're fixing the pipes and the water's not on, or there are mowers all around you. And then also, this is something that we don't always think about, but with preservation projects, is the weather appropriate for your treatment? So It's hot in the summer in Texas. Most preservation products are ideally used when it's partly cloudy and kind of nice in the 70s. It's not great to use them when it's really hot and sunny outside, and that is because when you apply a product like a cleaner, the water will evaporate very quickly and it can leave a film of that cleaning product on the surface. So if you're working in the summers, you want to make sure you're working in the mornings when it's cooler, when you don't have that bright sun beating down. And then also if you're working in the winter, you don't want to work when you have any chance of freezing within a couple of days. I usually like to give myself 3 days before or after the project. And that is so that if there's any water, moisture that goes into the monument, it doesn't freeze and expand and crack the material. So, you know, those are two things to consider, you know, and then there's the, of course, outside, you know, temperature, forecasted temperature. It might be 95 degrees outside, but the surface of your monument might be a lot warmer. And then also if you're working in the winter, it might only be 38 degrees outside, but think about what temperature it might be at night if you're in the shade, things like that. So definitely try to plan your project around kind of weather that's appropriate for the project that you're doing. Then safety is, again, really important for working at historic sites. You always want to do an assessment of the general area, and that means looking for tripping hazards on the ground. Those might be, you know, different indentions, sunken graves, partially sunken monuments or footstones. Those could be, you know, metal pins that have been dislodged and fallen out. So make sure there aren't any tripping hazards. And then also check above, below and above for falling hazards. So tree branches, nearby unstable monuments. Look for all of that, you know, doing a good assessment of the area. And then you also want to wear appropriate PPE. So depending on what you're using, you likely will need some kind of safety glasses. You may or may not want to wear gloves, although I recommend it. I usually recommend covering your legs with either long pants or a long skirt if you prefer, and using closed-toed shoes. You know, steel-toed boots are always preferable, but certainly tennis shoes work as well. You know, remembering when you're working at a historic site, at a cemetery, to work slowly and thoughtfully, so that, you know, safety is certainly a big one to keep in mind. And then, you know, you always want to work with a buddy or a partner. Monuments, although they look very delicate and beautiful, are very heavy, and they can be unstable for a variety of reasons. You may not have any indication that that little pin has corroded and this monument is, you know, just almost at its literal tipping point. So always best practice to work with somebody else, make sure people know that you're there in case anything happens. And then, you know, you're on to your treatment. So you want to plan your treatment before you begin. You want to know what you're doing. You want to have all of your materials. You're using materials that are appropriate for historic stone. You always want to start with and use the gentlest means possible. That's typically starting with low pressure water and moving up. If you're using a product, you want to test that product based on the manufacturer's instructions prior to full application. And sometimes with adhesives, that means, you know, doing kind of a swatch of that adhesive and letting it dry out in the sun at your house for 2 weeks and seeing, you know, how stable it is under UV. So, you know, always want to do those tests. As I mentioned, make sure the water's on at the cemetery. If you need water, make sure you have more than enough water. So you don't want a conservative amount of water, you want an excess of water. You may or may not need to protect adjacent monuments or cemetery features. So we keep talking about, you know, doing your tests using the gentlest means possible. Well, if you are working on a limestone monument and you have marble fencing next to, or metal fencing next to it, and you've tested on your limestone monument, but not on your fencing, you don't want any of your product to get on that fencing. So, you know, making sure you're protecting those, you know, you can use a breathable tarp. Just, you know, making sure everything that you're working with has been tested and is a good compatible material. You know, when you're cleaning, one of the best practices is you want to start at the bottom and work your way up. And then, of course, when you're working at a public site, a historic site, you always want to clean up at the end of your project. You want to keep a tidy space while you're working, you know, especially if you're working with mortars and things like that. You want to make sure that there's no debris left in the cemetery. And then you're done, you've done a beautiful job, and then you're going to document again, doing the same thing. You're going to add this kind of after record with your first record so that everything is together for this one kind of monument or object or structure. You're going to make sure these records are in an easily accessible location, that they're labeled in a way that anybody can access them. You've considered your location-based system, but really, you know, you've documented what you've done so that if somebody comes back 25 years later, they want to see, you know, what product did this person use or has been used on this monument for restoration in the past, they can hopefully pull up your record and see, and then that will help them better preserve this monument in the future. I'm almost done, home stretch here. You know, a couple of things to keep in mind when we're doing cemetery preservation is, you know, do no harm. Always select your gentlest means possible for your treatment approach. In general, the purpose of preservation is not to make historic resources look like new. Our purpose is really to maintain and stabilize these materials for the future, to really allow these monuments to commemorate the people that they were, you know, erected for, and the people buried in the cemetery, and the past members of our community. So we're not trying to make something look like it did the day that it was set. We're trying to keep these resources, you know, within our cemeteries and within our communities for as long as possible. Always consider safety and documentation. You know, when in doubt, if you're not sure, sometimes things are kind of hard to suss out and identify. When in doubt, document the existing conditions and wait until you have more information or more confidence in what the material is or what the conditions are. Work slowly, work thoughtfully. You know, working in cemeteries they're really great places to work. There's no need to rush. These monuments, these fences, these sites are not going anywhere. So there's, you know, no need to rush through any projects when you're working in a cemetery. And then lastly, just going to talk about a couple of resources that you can reference if you are interested in finding some more information. The Texas Historical Commission has some good information on cemetery preservation. NCPTT, the National Park Service National Center for Preservation Training and Technology in Natchitoches, Louisiana, has really good resources and reports and studies and presentations on cemetery preservation. The National Park Service recently published a preservation brief, number 48, on how to preserve gravestone markers. It was co-written by Fran Gale, who is a former UT instructor that many of us studied with and worked with. The Association for Gravestone Studies has a Texas chapter. They have some great information and resources, not only online, but, you know, with real people that you can talk to. The Association for Preservation Technology, again, I'm the president of the Texas chapter of that, and we certainly have cemetery workshops and different programming and resources for that. Sometimes restoration product manufacturers will have good resources for you. And then, you know, federal, state, local cemeteries and cemetery stewards across the United States, you know, may have master plans. They may have great people like Meredith and Rachel you can reach out and help get connected to different resources with. So there's certainly a lot out there. I would encourage you to keep diving into them. That is my presentation. But I'm really excited to keep working with Rachel and Meredith at the city cemeteries. Sorry, that was a little bit long, but And that's
Oh,
just
thank
the
you.
tip of the iceberg in terms of cemetery information. So there's always a lot to talk about.
Incredible. Izabella, thank you so much. That was such excellent information. And I have to let everyone know that, as Izabella mentioned, Meredith and I did a site visit at the city cemeteries with Izabella, and it was just so fascinating to walk through the cemeteries with her as she's pointing out all the different materials, all of the conditions, thinking about different projects that we could participate in. So I'm very excited for all of you who will be joining us for the Cemetery Stewardship Program. So that's something to look forward to. And Izabella, we did have a couple of questions. We'll keep it brief so that we're respectful of everyone's time, especially yours. And then I think we'll finish with some next steps as we discuss moving forward with the stewardship program opportunity. But one question came from Kyla, and I know you touched on zinc in a little bit in your presentation on materials, but she wanted to know if there's a specific time period or region where the use of zinc was common. And she says that's the one material she's genuinely surprised by.
Yeah, so I think that they were patented in I think the mid 19th century, and there's just a lot of really great information that I don't know particularly off the top of my head. I know they were made in the Northeast initially and then kind of manufactured and spread throughout the United States, but a lot of Texas cemeteries have them. So they're those, the thing that usually draws my eye to them is they're so crisp and clean looking. The raised letters just have that crispness that you just don't really see in other historic monuments, but they still have the historic form. So they were very popular for a long time. I think probably 50 or 60 years, you'll see them just across the United States. And I promise you, once you've seen one, you'll start to see them everywhere. Once you know what they look like, you'll start to see them. And if you give them a little knock, you can hear that they're hollow and metal.
I love that. And then we had another interesting question that I think is really great because it kind of is an example of how many interesting stories that you come across when you're working in cemeteries or researching grave sites. And this comes from Murray. And it's odd question. After my uncle passed away, we found a headstone, probably granite and mostly intact, in his yard from 1914. We did some research and found the owner. She was probably buried alone with the headstone, and several years later, she was buried with her husband 100 miles away. The wife and husband now have a joint headstone. The church doesn't want her original headstone and they couldn't locate the family. Is it okay to keep it and repurpose it, bury it? Can it be used for repairs? So this is maybe not related exactly to cemetery conservation, but a very interesting question. And I'm wondering if you've ever come across something similar to that.
So I have, and it's actually pretty common to have, like this example, a spouse pass away, and then when the remaining spouse passes, that they get a joint monument, and then you have a leftover monument. Sometimes you'll have monuments that have misspellings or misinformation that aren't able to be replaced later. You also will have a lot of instances where families can only afford a certain monument when somebody passes away and then decide to get a different monument at a later point in time. One thing that you can do with those, or sometimes you'll have something kind of neat like a handmade monument that gets replaced by, a monumental granite monument later. So the monument belongs to the person who paid for it. So technically, so I can't necessarily speak to what you can do to it if you don't own it. But usually you would get permission from the family. So next of kin, just, releasing it to you to do, since they technically do currently own it. Sometimes those types of monuments will be used in like workshops. So people could do, cleaning tests or repair tests on those types of monuments. Sometimes those extra monuments will be set at the bottom, so at the foot, as they're not really a footstone, but they are kind of a footstone. But yeah, that definitely happens. And then sometimes you'll have like these very interesting ornate limestone monuments that have deteriorated and the family wants to replace them. and then you have this very old historic monument, and there's not really a monument graveyard, so to speak, for those. But it's a good question, and there's always a different solution, so I would be curious to end up to hear what it ends up doing.
Absolutely. And I'm sure there's no shortage of stories like that when you're working in cemeteries, or, you know, when you find resources like this. So we've gotten a lot of really great feedback in the chat. So thank you all so much for participating. I think that we can finish by talking a little bit about the upcoming Cemetery Stewardship Program and letting everybody know about next steps. So we're very lucky that Izabella will be our trainer for the upcoming Cemetery Stewardship Program that's under development. And we've scheduled the in-person workshop for June 12th and June 13th, the mornings of that Saturday and Sunday. So everyone who's registered for this webinar will receive an email that'll have registration information for the Cemetery Stewardship Program. That will be limited. So just, you know, maybe 10 to 12 participants. And if you are, you know, watching this as a recording and you'd like to participate, please feel free to send me an email at rachel@sapreservation.com, RACHEL@sapreservation.com, and we can give you some information about the Cemetery Stewardship Program. Meredith, would you like to add anything about the program coming up in June?
Just that I'm very excited. It's going to be a start of something big and something very important. So I'm just so glad to have such great attendance at this session, and whoever views it as the recording. It'll be hands-on. We will be walking the cemetery. We'll be doing cleanings that day, and maybe even some painting. I know there's some fence line that we can go ahead and test out, that restorative like ceiling paint on it. There's a lot to do, and it's definitely going to be more than just 2 days of work.
Absolutely. So we're super enthusiastic. I know that many of you are as well, and we're really excited to get to meet you all and hopefully work with you all in our in-person workshop. And once again, many thanks to you, Izabella, for sharing all of your knowledge with us and for agreeing to be our trainer in the upcoming workshop. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing you soon. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Bye, everyone. See you at the cemetery.
Bye.